am back with my second video. I hope you all liked my Lilith video a lot. I had a lot of fun putting it together, and I think that if you liked the Lilith video, you're probably gonna like this one too. So I thought for my second video, I would do a video about my second most requested topic, which would be about a being that goes by many different names. Some people call him Satan, some people call him Lucifer, Diablo, the devil. So my favorite professor in college was a religious studies scholar who focused on the historical development of LDS or Mormonism. He didn't teach any classes on his specialty, which I think was like a really missed opportunity. But he did teach some of my favorite classes. The cult controversy was one. The second one was demons, devils, and possessions. Demons, devils, and possessions, that class had such an impact on me and really kind of focused my interests in religious studies. So I remember on the first day of demons, devils, and possessions, he started the class and he came up with this prompt and he said, draw what you think the devil looks like. And he gave us a few minutes to do it. And inadvertently, everyone pretty much came up with the same drawing. So the devil, he has horns, you know, he has a tail, sometimes pointed ears, a beard, cloven feet, stuff like that, hairy legs. That image of the devil is so ingrained in our cultural psyche that it's kind of hard to imagine him any other way, right? So we're going to trace the historical and cultural lineage of the devil figure. And I'm going to put a little disclaimer in this video, just as I did in the Lilith video, that trying to trace this figure through history can become very confused and convoluted. There are so many different sources that are oftentimes contradictory that it's kind of hard to make sense of it all. So just keep that in mind. I might see things that contradict other things that I've said, but that's just the way it goes with history, right? Everyone has a different idea about what something means. So there's going to be contradicting views. I also want to point out that this video would be stupid long if I were to list every single mention of this kind of figure through history. So I'm just going to pick and choose the ones that I think are most impactful. Okay, so we are going to start, as with most things do, with the Hebrew Bible. And in particular, we're going to focus on the book of Isaiah, just like we did in the Lilith video. I feel like that book has a lot of stuff, a lot of depth and detail, and a lot of things to look into. Anyway, so the book of Isaiah. So scholars believe that the book of Isaiah is comprised of three separate, distinct collections of writings. The first is Isaiah 1 through Isaiah 39. And scholars think that that one was written sometime in the 8th century BCE. The second one is comprised of Isaiah 40 through Isaiah 55, and they think that one was written sometime in the 6th century. And then finally, the last collection includes Isaiah 56 through Isaiah 66, and that one was written sometime after the return from the Babylonian exile. The passage that we're going to focus on is in Isaiah 14. So Isaiah 14 features a condemnation of a Babylonian king, most likely Nebuchadnezzar II. Scholars think it's Nebuchadnezzar II, wherein Nebuchadnezzar is referred to as Helel ben Shahar, which means shining one in Hebrew. Historically, this phrase was used to refer to the planet Venus. In antiquity, there were a lot of myths surrounding Helel, the light bringer, Venus, and Venus's movements through the sky, and then Venus being outshone by the sun. If you know anything about like astronomy, Venus is the morning star and then disappears during the day and then comes back at night. So ancient peoples wrote a lot of different mythologies to try and explain why the hell that would happen. So by comparing Nebuchadnezzar to Venus and calling him Helel ben Shahar, the authors of this section of Isaiah are suggesting that Nebuchadnezzar's reign will be short-lived like the light of Venus. It'll be outshone by the sun. You're probably thinking, what does that have to do with the devil, right? I mean, what does Venus have to do with the devil? It's a planet. It's not a supernatural being, right? Well, in the 4th century, the texts that would come to comprise the Bible were translated into Latin, and this translation became known as the Vulgate. The translators working on the Vulgate substituted the Latin Lucifer, a name for the planet Venus, with the Hebrew Hallel ben Shahar. So this was all fine and dandy, and people understood this, until the translators working on the King James Bible came across this passage. And then, due to an incorrect understanding of Latin, they took Lucifer, the word used to compare Nebuchadnezzar to the planet Venus, as a proper name, and they capitalized it. So that's why the devil is sometimes known as Lucifer. We'll get a little bit more into this a little bit later on. So that's where the misunderstanding of the name Lucifer began. But what about the whole Lucifer falling from heaven thing, right? The whole trope of a supernatural being wanting to be the Most High, only to be cast down, has its basis in ancient Sumerian mythologies, like most things. In particular, the mythologies surrounding the goddess Inanna. In 2 different myths, including Inanna's descent to the underworld and Inanna and Shukalatuda, Inanna's actions seem to mirror the movements of Venus in the sky, so say scholars. In Inanna's descent into the underworld, Inanna is allowed to enter the underworld. She's killed, and then she is resurrected 3 days later and allowed to return to the heavens. Does that sound like anyone you know? Some scholars believe that this story is meant to mirror the movements of Venus through the sky, and in particular, Venus's movements through the sky, beginning with the spring equinox. And then in the myth of Inanna and Shukalatuda, Inanna is described as searching the heavens for her attacker. And according to some scholars, her movements mirror the movements of Venus in the sky. So, yeah. This trope will be expanded upon in later Jewish apocrypha, so we'll get back to this a little bit later in the video. Next in the Hebrew Bible is going to be an excerpt from the book of Job. According to scholars, the book of Job was written sometime between the 7th and the 4th centuries BCE. The first chapter of the book of Job describes a scene wherein the sons of God, present themselves before God. God asks a particular member of this group, called Satan, where he's been. Satan replies that he has been roaming the earth. God asks Satan if he had ever considered Job, and then Satan then asks God to allow him to punish Job, and God accepts. We are told that thereafter, Satan destroyed all of Job's flocks. He killed Job's children and his servants, and he took away all of his wealth, as well as afflicting him with boils. After all of these horrible experiences, Job still refused to condemn God and instead praises him. So in the original Hebrew, the word used is ha-Satan, H-A-S-A-T-A-N, which today can be translated as the accuser or the adversary. So ha-Satan or Satan means accuser or adversary. So this word was not used to describe like the devil as we know him today. Instead, it's used to refer to a member of God's divine council. I've heard him lovingly referred to as like God's prosecutor. So that's kind of funny. So while ha-Satan is used to refer to the divine member of God's heavenly council, the generic Satan is used in the Hebrew Bible often to refer to any generic accuser. The generic accuser, Satan with a small s, is often applied to generic supernatural beings acting on behalf of God. So one example would be the accuser in David's census story in 1 Chronicles 21, or the story of Balaam and the donkey at Numbers 22. It's even used to, it's even applied to mortal beings, such as its use in 1 Kings 11 to describe the mortal adversaries of King Solomon. So Satan means adversary or accuser. It's someone that is opposed to you, and it can be used to refer to supernatural beings like the member of God's divine council, or it can be used to refer to mortal opposers, as with the example in 1 Kings 11. Okay. So as with the misattribution of Lucifer as a proper name in the translation of the book of Isaiah in the King James Bible, the word ha-Satan was replaced in the Koine Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible called the Septuagint. Ha-Satan was replaced by the Greek Diabolos, which means slanderer, so it's kind of similar to accuser or opposer or adversary or something like that. And Diabolos is where the English word devil comes from, so that's where we get the devil. As I discussed in my Lilith video, Jewish religion and culture was heavily influenced by Zoroastrianism during the Second Temple period. The Jewish people in exile were introduced to the Zoroastrian god of evil and darkness called Angra Mainyu. During the Second Temple period, the idea of Satan or another figure that acts as an embodiment of evil really flourished, with many pseudo-epigraphal texts being written during this time. So I'm going to start going through these texts. The first pseudo-epigraphal text I'm going to talk about is the Book of Enoch, which is my absolute favorite religious text. Oh, there's just so much in there. It's all so interesting. So the Book of Enoch was written sometime between 300 and 100 BCE. And the text tells us that a group of 200 supernatural beings existed called the Watchers. And most people equate the Watchers with angels. So the Watchers were tasked with supervising the earth and all of the humans inhabiting it. They were supposed to oversee them all. Corruption obviously takes hold in the Watchers. They begin to teach humans things that they're not supposed to know. So they start teaching them the art of divination. They start teaching them astrology. They start teaching them weapon and war making, how to write, meteorology, enchantments, and even cosmetics. And all of this is detailed. They even have sexual relations with human women. The Watchers are led by a being named Samjaza, and alongside another Watcher named Azazel, they spread sin and corruption throughout humanity. After all of their transgressions, the Watchers were sealed in caves around the world in order to await judgment. The Watchers are described as having followed the ways of Satan, and it's described that Satan is a tormentor of both sinful humans and sinful Watchers in the Book of Enoch. Similar to the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees tells pretty much the same story. I'm not going to get into the dating of the Book of Jubilees because that is a really, really controversial subject, so I'm just going to get right into it. The only change made in the Book of Jubilees is pretty much that the Watchers are being led by a being named Mistema instead of Samjaza. Mistema stops God from sealing away all of the Watchers in caves for all eternity, and instead he talks God into keeping some of the Watchers on God's staff. God accepts this. Great idea, right? The Watchers are then tasked with tempting humans into committing sin so that they can be punished. We're also told that Mistema is responsible for talking God into testing Abraham by ordering him to sacrifice Isaac. Okay. There are other Jewish apocryphal texts that deal with themes similar to this, so I'm just going to move on because I think those are the big two. Satan really is dealt with differently depending on which Jewish exegesis you're reading. For example, Satan is often aligned with the abstract Yetzer Hara, which is it's hard to describe, but it's basically like the inclination to do evil in the Talmud. Satan is also referred to as a physical being in the Talmud. Two tales are found in the Kiddushin that describe Satan as a physical being. In the first, Satan disguises himself as a woman in order to tempt two rabbis into sin. And then in the second, Satan disguises himself as a filthy, rude beggar in order to tempt a certain sage into breaking the mitzvah of hospitality. All right, Satan likes to dress up in costumes, apparently. Okay, so from here, I'm going to transition from the Jewish historical cultural understanding of Lucifer, Satan, Diablo, the devil, whatever you want to call him, into the Christian viewpoint. You'll notice that while there are mentions of these figures in Jewish literature, there aren't actually that many, and it doesn't seem like that important of a concept in the Jewish cultural viewpoint. In contrast, the Christian idea of the devil is super pervasive, right? So why is the devil such a popular concept in Christianity when his origins are that of a heavenly prosecutor? Hopefully we can clarify that. Probably the most well-known story of Satan in the New Testament is the one of the temptation of Christ, right? The temptation of Christ in the desert. Told in all three synoptic gospels, this story features Satan trying to tempt Jesus into turning away from God. Side note, I always thought it was kind of funny that in Matthew and Luke's telling of the story, Satan offers Jesus all the kingdoms of the earth, and Jesus just kind of accepts that these kingdoms are Satan's to give away. So this makes me wonder, like, what the writers of the gospel thought. Like, did they think all of the kingdoms of the earth were owned by the devil and under the influence of Satan? So that's kind of interesting. The Gospel of Luke intimates that Satan and the demons he controls cause illness in humanity. These illnesses include arthritis, fever, leprosy, among other things. And Luke also tells us that Satan entered Judas, which caused him to betray Jesus. The Gospel of John is interesting in that it seems that the author was trying to place the Holy Spirit in the role of Satan in the Hebrew Bible. So at John 16, 7 and 8, we're told that the Holy Spirit will accuse the world concerning sin, justice, and judgment. If that's not Satan, I don't know what is. And then the Gospel of John also explains that Satan is the archon of the cosmos, which is a nice little Gnostic call out. There's a lot of little Gnostic things, I think, in the Gospel of John that should be looked into. So the last place in the New Testament where we see this figure is in the book of Revelation. And the book of Revelation probably has the most in-depth descriptions of Satan, the devil, whatever, in the whole Bible. So in Revelation, Satan figures as the ruler of the Roman Empire. He's described as a great red dragon with 7 heads, 7 crowns, 10 horns, and a tail. Some scholars put forth that this description is a callback to the 4 beasts in the sea from the book of Daniel, or others say that it's a callback to the descriptions of the Leviathan from various passages in the Hebrew Bible. We're told at Revelation 12, 7 through 10, I'm going to read you a quote, and war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon. The dragon and his angels fought back, but they were defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. The great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who was called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven proclaiming, "Now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our who accuses them day and night before our God." Notice that last line called the great dragon, Satan of Revelation, an accuser, aligning him with the Satan of the Hebrew Bible. So that's kind of interesting. A little side note, I want to take a second to explain the quote from Revelation 13:18 that states, "This calls for wisdom. Let anyone with understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a person. Its number is 666. It's important to take note that the authors of the New Testament and early followers of Jesus in general did not think that they were taking part of a new religion. They were not Christians. They thought they were still Jews. They were acting in a continuation of Jewish prophecy wherein there was believed to be a Messiah that would come one day, and Jesus was fulfilling that. He was the Messiah, so they still thought they were Jewish. And because of that, the author of Revelation would have been familiar with gematria, which is a Jewish numerology system that assigns numbers to letters. Scholars throughout history have come up with a lot of different interpretations as to who this passage could be referring to. But nowadays, most agree that it's talking about the Roman Emperor Nero. In gematria, the Greek form of Nero's name translated into Hebrew adds up to the numerical value of 666. From this, one could infer that the entirety of the book of Revelation is a critique on the Roman Empire that had been prosecuting early believers in Christ. So take that as you will. Now I'm going to move on to the beliefs of early Christian writers and their thoughts on this figure. So Christians have generally interpreted that the snake that tempts Eve in the Garden of Eden is Satan. Even though that's not stated anywhere at all, right? Like, it's just referred to as a snake. So their rationale for thinking that the snake was Satan is they draw on Revelation 12:7, which calls Satan that ancient serpent. As I stated before, this passage is actually drawing comparison with the description of the four beasts in the book of Daniel, or the description of, or the descriptions of the Leviathan in the Hebrew Bible. So, the first person to make that comparison was the 2nd century Christian apologist writer Justin Martyr. Funnily enough, early pagans such as Celsus thought it was so crazy that a Most High God would have an opponent, right? And he stated, "It is blasphemy to say that the greatest God has an adversary who constrains his capacity to do good," and said that Christians impiously divide the kingdom of God, creating a rebellion in it, as if there were opposing factions within the divine, including one that is hostile to God. I have to say, I agree with Celsus. Early Christians also drew comparisons between Lucifer, the light bringer Venus, with Satan, citing a quote in the Gospel of Luke. It's Gospel of Luke 10:18, wherein Jesus states, "I watched Satan fall from heaven like a flash of lightning." Other early Christian writers latched onto this idea, trying to find more evidence for this interpretation. So writers like Origen, Jerome, Cyprian, and Ambrosius found similarities between the mythology surrounding Lucifer and Satan. So they drew comparisons between the Babylonian king described in that Isaiah passage that I talked about earlier with the description of Satan being overthrown in the book of Revelation. So that's where that connection comes in between Lucifer and Satan. It's a little confusing, right? Early Christians also believed that Satan and his demons had the ability to possess a person, necessitating an exorcism. As it's written in the New Testament, Jesus gave the ability to exorcise demons to all those who believed in him. Scholars do note that most ancient peoples who claimed to be possessed didn't really experience any kind of like crazy hallucinations, spectacular stuff, anything like that. Most often they were afflicted with religious fears and anxiety and evil thoughts, meaning they wanted to sin. So that's what they were getting exorcised. From the patristic era, we're going to move on to the Middle Ages. While the cultural imprint of Satan is not as pronounced in this era, the figure still definitely makes a mark. He was a character in many medieval plays wherein he was a figure of comic relief. He was often depicted skipping across the stage, falling down, and farting. So, there's also a book written in the Middle Ages, I think it was around 1260 CE, called The Golden Legend. In this book, it features Satan constantly being duped by a bunch of saints. Scholars tell us that The Golden Legend was actually the most popular book of this time period, with more manuscripts surviving of this book than of the Bible. Another book published during this time is the Canon Episcopi, which was written sometime in the 11th century. This book details a popular belief of the time in witchcraft, and it describes various beliefs surrounding witchcraft, including the idea that witches dealt with and had sex with demons or the devil, and even the belief that witches kidnapped human babies in order to murder them and eat them as a part of their satanic rituals. Okay. In 1326, Pope John the 22nd issued a papal bull which condemned divinatory folk practices as a means of speaking with Satan. And then by the 1400s, the Catholic Church saw witchcraft as a conspiracy against the church outright, and that Satan was leading that conspiracy against the church. According to the book Malleus Maleficarum that was published in 1487, all sorcery is the work of Satan. Most witch trials were based on the belief that witches were consorting with Satan and demons and were therefore working in opposition of the church, and that they should be killed for that, obviously. Some scholars estimate that at least 60,000 people were executed during the entire span of the witchcraft hysteria. Pretty sad. Satan also figures in a few other books from this period, so I'm just going to go quickly through them. He's featured in the Inferno section of the Divine Comedy, wherein he's described as being frozen from the breast down in ice in the ninth circle of hell. He has 3 faces and wings that cause freezing wind and ice to torment all those who are condemned to the ninth circle of hell. He's also mentioned in the Canterbury Tales, and in one of the stories in that book, a friar arrives in hell, but he sees no other friars, even after being told that there's millions of them. And then Satan lifts his tail and reveals that all of the friars live in his anus. Finally, he's featured in the story of John Faustus, who makes a deal with the demon Mephistopheles, selling his soul to Satan for 25 years of earthly pleasure. Many Puritan settlers in America really believed that Satan had its grips in the settlements in the New World. John Winthrop claimed that the devil made some Puritan women give birth to stillborns that had claws and horns. Cotton Mather wrote that the devil swarmed Puritan settlements like the frogs of Egypt. Some Puritans even believed that the Native Americans worshipped Satan and called them children of the devil. Some even claimed to see Satan in the flesh at some Native American ceremonies. Next, we're going to move on to the modern era. So many movements in modern Western esotericism have embraced Satan in both theistic Satanism and atheistic Satanism. So in theistic Satanism, Satan is raised from one who opposes God to one that is deserving of worship. Some groups that practice theistic Satanism are Luciferians, the Order of the Nine Angels, the Temple of Set, and the Joy of Satan. In atheistic Satanism, Satan is used as a symbol of personal liberty and individualism, among other things. So some groups that practice atheistic Satanism are the Church of Satan, the Satanic Temple, and the First Satanic Church. There was also the whole satanic panic thing that took place in the United States in the 80s and 90s, which that could probably be a whole other video. So the idea was that there was a secret cabal of devil-worshipping Satanists operating out of daycare facilities around the United States, and that these groups were utilizing the children in their satanic rituals. Most scholars nowadays paint the satanic panic as an unsubstantiated moral panic, arguing that out of the 12,000 cases of satanic ritual abuse that were brought forth, none were ever able to be proven. This moral panic has even been compared to the modern QAnon movement. I want to get back to the prompt that started this video, wherein I asked you to think about what Satan looks like. I'm assuming that you came up with a similar depiction to everyone else that this question is asked. So horns, a tail, cloven feet, hairy legs, a pitchfork, that whole kind of thing. So I'm going to try to explain to you why Satan looks like that in our cultural mindset. It's easy to say that the normal cultural depictions of the devil have him sporting goat-like features, the horns, the tail, the hairy legs, the cloven feet, all that kind of stuff. While some Christian scholars believe that the devil became associated with goats due to the parable of the sheep and goats at Matthew 25:31 through 46. Others, like St. Jerome, put forth that the devil was equated with goats due to the demonization of Hellenistic gods. According to St. Jerome, early Christians equated satyrs and fauns with demons. More simply, the devil looks like a goat because early Christians were attempting to discredit the pagan gods worshipped by others, namely Pan. The devil's pitchfork can also be thought of along the same line. Poseidon was often depicted holding a trident. So the depiction of the devil that we know is basically a device in order to discredit pagan beliefs from back in the day. The devil, Satan, Lucifer, Diablo, whatever you want to call him, his history is long and complicated, right? I hope this video helped you understand it a little bit better. Make sure to like and subscribe. Thanks, everyone.